welcome. So, we continue our exploration of His Holiness, the 13th Dalai Lama. I found this great book called Tibet, published in 2011 by Dr. Sam von Schaik. I'm not sure about his personal background, but his history is definitely very grand view picture, grandeur, and he does not scare away from making broad statements in regards to certain conflicts. And so it's very refreshing to read sometimes after, reading a lot of micro histories, and then you get this sweeping, broad, with lots of conclusions kind of history. So then you're it makes you think of bigger questions as well. So he, for example, in this book talks about how certain traditions of Tibetan Buddhism was affected by political interactions and how they used magic to counter some of those political repercussions. And I think among a lot of English-speaking academics, they shy away from the occult. They don't really talk about how the politics and occult interact. And so for me, it was very eye-opening that someone as high of a caliber as Dr. Sam has discussed the occult within the realm of the Tibetan identity and history. So let's dive into chapter 8, Independence, 1904 to 1950. The Wandering Dalai Lama. So I've covered some of this in my previous sharing of BookTube's books on YouTube. And he traveled a lot. So this is a review of what he did. And then we'll get into new material that I have only read in Dr. Sam's book. So buckle up and get ready for some political history. The Wandering Dalai Lama, His Holiness. Om Mani Padme Hum. While Francis' young husband was anxiously awaiting the announcement of the honors list in London, a long camel train approached the capital of Mongolia. It was November 1904, and the 13th Dalai Lama had spent the last 3 months trekking across the frozen plains of northern Tibet and the arid deserts of Central Asia. Though he had left Lhasa with just 8 companions, his entourage had grown to several hundred people by the time it approached Urga. The highest reincarnate Lama of Mongolia, the Jetsun Dampa, sent a palanquin for the Dalai Lama as he approached the capital city. With crowds thronging either side of the road, the Dalai Lama held 2 scarves that touched the heads of the faithful as the palanquin passed by. Once he had settled into his new quarters in Urga, the Dalai Lama began the usual round of receiving visitors and bestowing blessings. Meanwhile, his right-hand man, Dorjiev, set off for St. Petersburg to ask the Tsar for help against the British menace. Dorjiev did not manage to arrange an audience until early 1906, when once again the Tsar was evasive. Of course, he assured Dorjiev Russia would help Tibet, but considering the recent losses in its war with Japan, such help would have to be gradual in nature. The Tsar did promise to help by negotiating with China and Britain, but as this was something Russia was going to have to do anyway, it hardly represented going out on a limb to assist Tibet. Also on the table during Dorjiev's audience with the Tsar was the issue of the 9th Panchen Lama, who seemed to be making a play to rule Tibet in the Dalai Lama's absence. The British, who remembered how much further George Bogle had got with the Panchen Lama than the Dalai Lama in the 18th century, had already been planning to cultivate him. In 1906, the Panchen Lama visited British India, where he met the Viceroy, Lord Minto. And by the way, there is a French historian who wrote in English on the 13th Lama, on the 9th Panchen Lama. And we can cover that in the future if people are interested. So, he met the Viceroy, Lord Minto. The Russians were concerned about this, just as the British were concerned when reports of Dorjiev's latest encounter with the Tsar filtered through to them. The Manchu court was jittery too. A fairly innocuous telegram from the Tsar to the Dalai Lama expressing nothing more than esteem for his spiritual qualities alarmed the Chinese so much that they sent a special diplomatic mission to the Dalai Lama to warn him that if he intrigued with the Russian officials, he would be deposed. And so nearly 2 years passed while the Dalai Lama waited in Urga for the Russian response. Why did he not return to Lhasa sooner? For one thing, he knew that the Tibetan government could get on very well without him. After all, it had been doing so for years. Throughout the 19th century, the regents had held the young Dalai Lamas back from power, even killing them when necessary. The 13th Dalai Lama had grown up in an atmosphere of political intrigue, trying to make sense of a role that was always an uncomfortable hybrid of spiritual and political power, and one that may prefer to see as merely symbolic. The only previous Dalai Lama who had been able to wield power effectively was the Great Fifth, and that was with the military support of the Mongols. This may be why the 13th Dalai Lama now chose to tarry in the homelands of the Mongols. Indeed, the 13th had something of the Great Fifth about him. He had turned out to be a fine scholar in the Gelug academic tradition, becoming the first of the Dalai Lamas to be awarded the highest academic title of Geshe Larampa. But he was also a visionary who, like the Great Fifth, often experienced vivid dreams of Padmasambhava. Om Ahom Benzer Guru Pema Siddhi. Om Ahom Benzer Guru Pema. Still, his years in Lhasa had not been easy. The Japanese monk Eikai Kawaguchi, who visited the Tibetan capital in the early years of the 20th century, spent some time with the Dalai Lama and expressed great pity for him, surrounded as he was by ambitious and unscrupulous political climbers. Hence, he is so dangerously situated that he is obliged to pay the greatest attention to what is offered him to eat, lest some poison should have been put in it. I could not but shed tears for him when I thought there could be no court on earth so full of wicked courtiers. But the present Dalai Lama is so prudent and particular that the evildoers can get no chance of doing anything against him. The Japanese monk may have been exaggerating a little, but his feelings of pity were not unfounded. In 1900, the Dalai Lama had narrowly escaped a series of assassination attempts by the regent. One attempt might have been comical had it not been deadly serious. Folded up pieces of paper covered with black mantras were discovered hidden inside the soles of a pair of shoes intended for the Dalai Lama. In the end, the regent was caught and charged, and his accomplices were executed. The affair left a lasting wound in Lhasa politics. There were many who supported the regent and believed that the charges against him were just a way of clearing the old political class out of Lhasa. The monks of the regent's monastery of Tengyeling now became implacable opponents of the Dalai Lama. In the years to come, they would fight him alongside Chinese soldiers, but for now the worst thing that came from Tengyeling was a false prophecy. The worst thing that came from Tengyeling was a false prophecy stating that the current Dalai Lama would be the last. I just wanted to touch a bit about the political side of things. So, as you may or may not know, there is an area in India called Ladakh. And I didn't even know that Ladakh was part of India for the longest time, because in the administrative district where it's located, the name isn't even there. It's called Jammu and Kashmir. But then when you search, Ladakh is included in Jammu and Kashmir. And the great people of Ladakh, Jule, if you're Ladakhi watching this, Jule, I'm so grateful for them because they've kept their humbleness and faith in the Buddha Dharma so well. His Holiness Gyalwang Drukpa, he is actually considered another manifestation of Avalokiteshvara. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama is also considered a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara. And what I wanted to say was, once His Eminence Gyalwang Drukpa, His Eminence, His Holiness Gyalwang Drukpa, was asked to comment on the fact that many of Drukpa monasteries were being converted by Kagyu lamas into Karma Kagyu monasteries. And the newspaper was trying to make this about a Chinese incursion on Indian soil. And the Gyalwang Drukpa just didn't make that link. He was just like, okay, let it be. Because it's always, from the perspective of a Buddha Dharma practitioner, it's always better to have a monastery than to not have a monastery. So in the broadest sense, the sect at the end of the day is of little consequence to someone like Gyalwang Drukpa. And another Sakya Dharma lecturer in Canberra, Australia, also mentioned something similar. He said, do good wherever you can. And it doesn't matter if you do it in different religious spaces than your own Dharma. Because some Buddhists even pick and choose, in terms of which sects they want to practice within. Just a little caveat from my personal practicing perspective before we get into this heavy subject of the end of the Qing Empire and the Hunger Games. I invoke the blessings of Longchenpa, the Nyingma master, and we celebrated his 660th paranirvana. He went into nirvana on a water rabbit year, and this year is also a water rabbit year. And as you may or may not know, according to Chinese Tibetan zodiac, 60 years marks a cycle, and it was his 660th year. I just got this postcard and initiation last year, and how fortunate I am. Last year in the Gregorian calendar, but it was also still water rabbit year. So basically, I got initiated into dzogchen, Longchenpa, during his cycle of paranirvana. I just feel so fortunate and serendipitous that this happened in the same year. Okay, back to the book. We can now see why the Dalai Lama might have been less than keen to return to Lhasa after the British army pulled out. Yet things were getting uncomfortable in Urga as well. His host was the 8th Jetsun Dampa, who, despite being infamous as a drinker and womanizer, was still the most highly regarded reincarnate Lama in Mongolia. He was jealous of the attention received by the Dalai Lama, and in a fit of pique, in anger, went into the Dalai Lama's audience chamber and pulled his throne to pieces. Wow. After this, he became openly disrespectful, languidly lighting cigarettes and smoking in front of him. And then there were the Manchu Ambans, who made it clear that they did not want a Dalai Lama living in Mongolia. In one tense meeting, the Ambans told the Dalai Lama that he and his entourage were a strain on local resources. The Dalai Lama shouted at them, "In my 12 years of ruling Tibet, I have made a close enough study of you Manchus. I know you well, and I will not let you mock me any longer." It was clearly time to move on. At the beginning of 1906, the Dalai Lama began a long, leisurely eastward journey. Traveling through Amdo, the 13th, like so many before him, received the adulation of ordinary people and monks and the abundant gifts of officials and high lamas. But the Manchu court was nervous about the Dalai Lama's tour. That summer, it told the British legation, "The Dalai Lama is wandering about. We hope eventually to find some temple where he can settle down." In fact, the Dalai Lama had a temple in mind, Kumbum, the finest monastery in Amdo, pleasantly situated in the midst of rolling green hills, the place where the fifth had stayed on his way to meet the emperor. As he approached the monastery, the Dalai Lama was met by a grand procession of 1,000 lamas. He stayed over a year at Kumbum, enjoying the company of fine scholars, learning Sanskrit grammar and writing poetry. It was the last piece he was to know for a long, long time. Colonization. As the ripples of the young husband expedition reached China, the Manchu government was convinced that the British might launch another invasion at any moment, and this time cross into China itself. The only way to prevent this was to take control of Tibet. As one Manchu official put it, Tibet is the buttress on our national frontiers, the hand, as it were, which protects the face. The first step in making Tibet into a reliable buffer for China was to secure the wild and ungovernable Khampas. The man chosen for this task was Zhao Erfeng, a loyal servant of the Manchu Empire with an imperialist's disdain for other cultures, almost young husband's mirror image. Leading a crack battalion, he cut a swath through Batang and Litang, replacing local chiefs with Chinese officials and slaughtering those who opposed him with startling violence. The biggest obstacles to colonizing Kham were the monasteries and their fighting monks, and Zhao attacked them mercilessly. The monastery of Sanpeiling, which belonged to the Gelug school, held out the longest. Zhao eventually ended the resistance in June 1906 by sending men into the monastery disguised as monks. After fierce fighting, the monastery surrendered and every one of its monks was executed. As scenes of this kind were repeated in monasteries across Kham, Zhao gained a fearsome reputation. The Khampas called him Zhao the Butcher, but he saw himself quite differently. Like most of the Chinese of the time, he regarded Tibetans in general and Khampas in particular as barbarians, and saw himself as a bringer of civilization. He compared the role of the Chinese in Kham to that of the British in Australia, the French in Madagascar, and the Americans in the Philippines. Aiming to sinicize Kham as quickly as possible, he encouraged Chinese farmers to immigrate in a proclamation telling them to hasten to this promising land. New regulations were issued for the town of Batang, showing what the Manchus now had in mind for Tibet. These stated that all Tibetans were now subjects of the Chinese emperor and Chinese law and were to pay their taxes to China. Monks were banned from local government, and monasteries were not to house more than 300 monks. Tibetan men must wear Chinese clothes and the Manchu pigtail rather than the Khampa hairstyle, quote, which makes men resemble living demons. The Tibetan families had to take Chinese surnames, and a Chinese school was to be opened in Batang. This new approach was quite different from what the Khampas had seen before. It looked very much like colonization. When news of these events reached the Dalai Lama in Kumbum, he was most disturbed. His response was the traditional one. He asked the monastery's lamas to teach him their most powerful rituals, which he personally performed for several days. Then came more disturbing news. In August 1907, the British and the Russians had signed an agreement. It seemed that both sides had lost interest in the great game and that Russia had abandoned any thoughts of involvement with Tibet, agreeing now to recognize Britain's, quote, special interest in the maintenance of the status quo in the external relations of Tibet. As his options narrowed, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, decided to travel to Beijing for an audience with the Manchu emperor. The great entourage set off through the Sino-Tibetan borderlands, stopping to pay its respects at holy sites such as the tomb of Gewasel, the monk who kept the monastic lineage alive during Tibet's dark age. The 13th Dalai Lama spoke warmly of this region, and this was recalled some 30 years later when the next Dalai Lama was found nearby. Finally, in the autumn of 1908, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, stepped off the train in Beijing. At the Forbidden City, there was the usual struggle over ceremony. Would the Dalai Lama bow his head to the floor before the emperor as the officials demanded? He insisted that he would not. And so after a few days of negotiation, it was agreed instead that the emperor would stand to receive the Dalai Lama, who would touch the ground with his right knee. The audience was brief, polite, and devoid of content, and a separate audience with Empress Dowager Cixi, the real power behind the throne, went much the same way. When His Holiness was presented with a seal by the emperor, he noticed that the Chinese title had changed quite a bit from the one that was awarded to the Great Fifth. Gone were the flowery Chinese phrases, universal ruler of the Buddhist faith and holder of the scepter. In their place came sincerely obedient. Leaving troubled Beijing that December, the Dalai Lama was personally escorted by Puyi, the last emperor of the Manchu dynasty. The Tibetan party slowly wound its way towards Lhasa, unaware of the storm that was about to engulf it. Zhao the butcher had been busy and calm. He had taken over Durga and finally opened it up by building a modern road. He had also been making the case for sending troops further into Lhasa itself. This, he argued, was the only way to prevent another British invasion. The Manchu government approved of this plan, and 2,000 soldiers were sent towards Lhasa. Zhao was not with them, but was given his own troops and spent the next 2 years conquering the rest of Kham. When rumors of Chinese soldiers moving towards Lhasa reached the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, he was appalled and dispatched messages via the telegraph set up by the British. Yet he had no idea how to engage in modern international diplomacy. An angry telegram to the Foreign Office in Beijing had no effect. Another telegram was addressed to Great Britain and all the ministers of Europe. Nobody knew quite what to do with that. On Christmas Day 1909, the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, arrived back in Lhasa. He had been away for 5 years, but there was no time to settle in. Over the next few weeks, posters began to appear on the walls of Lhasa stating that Chinese troops were coming to protect them from foreign invaders. When the Dalai Lama asked the Amban what was going on, he was assured that no more than 1,000 soldiers were coming to police the trade marts. But then in February 1910, more than 2,000 soldiers marched into Lhasa. Few tried to stop them, and some Tibetans even welcomed them. A letter was delivered to the Dalai Lama promising that he could retain his spiritual authority, but mentioning nothing of his secular powers. Walled up in the Potala, the Dalai Lama and his ministers had a hurried meeting. They had heard that whatever the Amban was saying, the soldiers had been ordered to capture the Dalai Lama. Even if this did not happen, he would end up permanently cloistered in the Potala, truly an impotent figurehead. So the Dalai Lama decided to flee again, less than 2 months after he had arrived in Lhasa. At midnight, he and those ministers who decided to throw in their lot with him left the Potala, and at dawn they rode out of Lhasa. Shortly afterwards, the Amban discovered that the Dalai Lama had slipped the net. Not knowing which way he had gone, he sent cavalry both north and south. In fact, the Dalai Lama was heading south. It was a sign of his desperation that he had decided to go to British India. At this stage, he didn't know what to expect when he got there, but he hoped to get a boat to China and put his case before the emperor. In the lion's lair, it was a hard journey. The icy winds of February cut the Dalai Lama to the bone. At the ferry over the Tampo River, 200 soldiers caught up with his party, but were held back by a few Tibetans while the ferry crossed. As the Tibetan party rode up through the mountain passes, a heavy snow fell and the Dalai Lama fell ill with a cold. When he caught sight of his own reflection, his pallid face and cracked lips, he burst into tears. In this state, he crossed the border into Sikkim, arriving in the unknown and much feared territory of British India. The 2 British soldiers who manned the telegraph office near the border were woken in the middle of the night by a knocking. Tuck, tuck, tuck. Opening the door, they were surprised to see a group of very excited Tibetans saying, "Dalai Lama, Dalai Lama."
one of the soldiers, whose name was Luff, blinked into the darkness and asked, "Which of you blighters is the Dalai Lama?" When the Dalai Lama came to the door, the soldiers tried to persuade the Tibetans to stay in a nearby bungalow rather than the tiny telegraph office, but they weren't keen. So Luff let the Dalai Lama in, seated him by the fire, and made him a cup of tea. After he had recovered a bit, the Dalai Lama asked if he could use one of the soldiers' beds. Seeing their guns, he also asked if they would protect him if the Chinese attacked in the night. When the soldiers said that they would, he lay down and fell into his first deep sleep since fleeing Lhasa. The guns, in fact, were unloaded as no ammunition had arrived in the snowy weather. Still, in the morning, the two soldiers, holding their empty rifles, escorted the Dalai Lama's party for a while before promising to see off any Chinese who crossed the border. After they said their goodbyes, the two sergeants remarked to each other, "Thank heaven we've got the boss of Tibet off our bally hands safe and sound." And so the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, entered British India, passing through Sikkim and arriving in Darjeeling a mere 9 days after his precipitous flight from Lhasa. Things were changing fast for the Dalai Lama, and this new exile would not be like the last, with its slow, stately, and sumptuous processions. The Darjeeling authorities put His Holiness the Dalai Lama in a hotel on the main street, where his attendants managed to fashion a throne among the modern European furnishings. Here, tired, ill, stripped of his fine clothes, and with the barest bones of his entourage, the Dalai Lama met a representative of the British government in India. Charles Bell had just returned from a diplomatic mission in Bhutan when he was sent to meet the exiled Dalai Lama, a tall, upper-class Englishman. Bell was a fluent speaker of Tibetan and sympathetic to Tibetan culture. He was to become a lifelong friend of the Dalai Lama. Bell was impressed by the Tibetan meeting. Eyebrows curved high and a full mustache with the ends well waxed accentuated the alertness of the administrator rather than the priest meditating apart. His dark brown eyes were large and very prominent. They lit up as he spoke or listened, and his whole countenance shone with a quiet eagerness. The first photographs of the Dalai Lama taken around this time match Bell's description well. A few days later, the Dalai Lama and his entourage were taken to Calcutta to meet the Viceroy, Lord Minto. The Dalai Lama's view of the British was changing. Enemies one day become friends the next. Friends become enemies. His biographer points to the well-known maxim from Buddhism. Back in Lhasa, new posters appeared on the walls declaring that the 13th Dalai Lama was proud, extravagant, lewd, slothful, vicious, and perverse without parallel, violent and disorderly, disobedient to the imperial commands, and oppressive towards the Tibetans. End quote. Most importantly, the posters also announced that he was to be stripped of his title and treated like an ordinary person, while a new Dalai Lama was to be selected by the Amban using the golden urn. This last part of the order was never carried out. The Amban knew how much trouble it would cause. The last time the Chinese had stripped the Dalai Lama of his title, when he first fled Lhasa in 1904, the act's implications had been entirely ignored by the Tibetans. Still, the Amban made several moves to bring Lhasa under his control, taking over the role of police and courts and ordering the minting of new coins with both Tibetan and Chinese writing. Meanwhile, in Calcutta, the Dalai Lama met the Viceroy with Charles Bell acting as interpreter. The Dalai Lama tried to calm ongoing British suspicions about his relationship with Russia, telling Minto that Dorjiev had acted purely as a spiritual advisor to the Tsar. The British also took the Tibetan party to the Calcutta Zoo and, more significantly, to the Indian Museum, which held a recently discovered casket of the Buddha's relics thought to have been buried with the Buddhist emperor Kanishka in the 2nd century AD. The Dalai Lama held the casket and blessed the Buddhists in the room, who included the Prince of Sikkim and the exiled Prince of Durga. On his return to Darjeeling, The Dalai Lama declared that he and his entourage, which included several senior ministers, still represented the Tibetan government, even if it was a government in exile. Meanwhile, news came from Lhasa that the Amban had broken the sealed doors of the Dalai Lama's official residence, the Norbalinka, and was replacing the Tibetan ministers with Manchu officials. The Dalai Lama sat and waited for a response from the British. But the British were not inclined to get involved. For one thing, they were convinced that the Dalai Lama was still involved with Russia. Secret Foreign Office documents from this time set out a position that was to become sadly familiar to Tibetans throughout the 20th century. Quote, a strictly non-committal attitude on all points at issue between China and Tibet is more than ever necessary at the present juncture, end quote. So, on 4th May 1910, a telegram arrived from London for the Viceroy stating, quote, definite intimation should now be made to the Dalai Lama that there can be no interference between Tibetans and China on the part of His Majesty's government, end quote. A few days later, Charles Bell came to the Dalai Lama's room with the bad news. After the pleasant surprise of his friendly reception in India, this was a shock to the Dalai Lama. Quote, when I delivered the message to him as we sat together in the quietude of his room, he was so surprised and distressed that for a minute or two he lost the power of speech. That deprecating look in his eyes became for an instant the look of a man who is being hunted to his doom. Quickly, however, he cast it off and discussed the matter calmly and clearly, end quote. Despite his disappointment, the Dalai Lama still felt that the British were his best allies in his plans to return to Tibet. When the Amban, who had realized the hopelessness of appointing another Dalai Lama, sent him a letter suggesting that he return, the Dalai Lama replied with a strong criticism of what he saw as a betrayal by the emperor. Because of the above, he wrote, it is not possible for China and Tibet to have the same relationship as before, and insisted that any new agreements would have to be made with British mediation. Declaration of Independence. For now, there was not much the Dalai Lama could do. He was cut off from what was going on in Tibet, where life had largely returned to normal. After all, the Dalai Lama had been absent from Lhasa for all but a few weeks of the last 5 years, and many Lhasa Tibetans were untroubled by the Chinese presence. So the Dalai Lama and his entourage decided to spend the first months of 1911 touring India's sacred Buddhist sites. The British did what they could to assist the pilgrims, providing horses, rickshaws, a motor car, even a train that stopped and started at the Dalai Lama's convenience. At the Buddha's birthplace, Kapilavastu, the Tibetans were impressed by the sight of naked yogins, devotees of the god Shiva, holding tridents, their foreheads marked with red powder. The yogins were also pleased to see the Dalai Lama and offered him flower garlands. Though they were devotees of Shiva, to the Tibetans they looked like the fabled Mahasiddhas of the Buddhist tantric lineage. When a yogin beckoned to the Dalai Lama to enter his hut, the Dalai Lama demurred. As his biographer put it, suspecting defilement, he did not enter. At Bodh Gaya, the Dalai Lama meditated, restored the main statue of the Buddha, and performed a funerary ritual for an Englishman whose wife had recently died. He also took away from the site a small stone statue of the Buddha and another of Ganesh. His biographer noted that the local guardian spirits did not show any signs of annoyance. Had the Archaeological Survey of India known, there might have been some annoyance, but the ancient ways of the pilgrim and the modern scruples of the archaeologist are quite different. Then suddenly everything changed. In October 1911, rocked by a series of mutinies, the tottering Manchu dynasty collapsed. The Chinese soldiers stationed in Lhasa immediately mutinied, attacking the Amban. As the soldiers started looting the city, some Tibetans began to fight them. As soon as he heard what was happening, the Dalai Lama sprang into action. He sent one of his best young ministers secretly to Tibet to set up a war council with coordinating the uprising. Charles Bell passed on the British government's warning that the Dalai Lama should not encourage fighting in Tibet. To this, the Dalai Lama responded, "We must fight for the religion and our own freedom." To be continued.